I walked into that lake house carrying a worn duffel bag and wearing my oldest jeans, and I had no idea I was about to play the role of my life in someone else's carefully orchestrated performance. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a mother's protective instinct turned into the most humbling weekend of my 63 years on this earth. My daughter Emma never knew I made six figures. She grew up thinking we lived paycheck to paycheck, watching me clip coupons at the kitchen table every Sunday night, seeing me drive the same Honda Accord for 15 years. What she didn't see were the investment accounts I'd been building since she was in diapers, the rental properties I acquired one by one, the consulting work I did from home that paid more in a month than most people made in 6. I kept it hidden because I'd watched too many families torn apart by money. Children who grew entitled, relatives who suddenly needed loans, friends who disappeared when you stopped funding their lifestyle. If you've ever loved someone enough to lie to them for their own good, you know exactly the weight I carried every single day. Now, before I go any further, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. Are you listening while you're cooking dinner? Folding laundry? Lying in bed wondering if you made the right choices? Because this story, what I'm about to tell you, it changed everything I thought I knew about trust, about family, and about the masks we all wear. And if this resonates with you, check the description box below. I share more stories like this, real stories about the messy, complicated truth of family dynamics that nobody wants to talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. Emma met David 3 years ago at a charity fundraiser. He was a high school teacher, soft-spoken, thoughtful, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. I liked him immediately, which should have been my first warning sign. In my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it's because you haven't seen the whole picture yet. They got married last spring in a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens, just 40 people, simple and sweet. His parents couldn't make it. Something about his father's health and the long trip from upstate. Red flag number 2, but who was I to judge? I'd kept my own secrets. Then came the invitation. Emma called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, David's parents want to meet you. They're inviting us to their lake house for the weekend. Isn't that wonderful? They feel terrible they missed the wedding." I felt something twist in my gut, that old instinct that had served me well in business negotiations and bad relationships alike. "That's nice, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Tell me about them." "Oh, they're just regular people, you know. David says they're very down to earth. His dad worked in insurance his whole life, just retired. His mom was a school secretary. They saved up for years to buy this little place on the lake. Regular people. Down to earth." The same words I'd used to describe myself for decades, while my portfolio quietly grew into something that would have shocked everyone who knew me. I wondered what other lies we tell ourselves about the people we love. That's when I made the decision. I would go to this lake house, but I would go as the woman Emma thought I was, struggling, scraping by, the perpetual underdog who'd raised her daughter on grit and government assistance. I would see how these people treated someone they perceived as beneath them. Because here's what I'd learned in 6 decades of watching human nature: people reveal who they really are when they think you have nothing they need. I spent the week before the trip preparing my costume. I packed my clothes in an old duffel bag with a broken zipper, the kind you buy at a thrift store. I made sure every item I brought looked worn, faded, just threadbare enough to tell a story of hardship. I practiced my lines in the mirror, the apologetic tone of someone accustomed to being overlooked, the slight hunch in my shoulders that came from years of carrying invisible weight. The morning we left, I drove to Emma's apartment in my Honda. David loaded our bags into his car, and I caught him glancing at my duffel with something that might have been pity. Or judgment. It was hard to tell. "Mom travels light," Emma said, laughing, and I smiled that self-deprecating smile I'd perfected over the years. "Never needed much," I said. "Just happy to be included." The drive took 4 hours, winding through forests that grew denser as we headed north, past small towns where the gas stations still had mechanical pumps and the diners advertised breakfast all day. Emma and David chatted in the front seat about their jobs, about the summer reading list David was assigning his students, about whether they should get a dog. I sat in the back, watching the world slide by, wondering what waited for me at the end of this road. When we finally turned onto a gravel drive marked only by a weathered mailbox, I felt my heart start to hammer. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of water, sunlight dancing on the surface like scattered diamonds. And then the house came into view. It wasn't a cottage. It wasn't even what most people would call a lake house. It was a sprawling 3-story structure with floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound deck, a boat dock that looked like it could accommodate a small yacht. The landscaping alone probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Wow, Emma breathed. David, you said it was small. It is small, David said, and something in his voice made the hair on my neck stand up. You should see the main house in Connecticut. I climbed out of the car slowly, feeling the gravel shift beneath my discount sneakers, and that's when I saw them. David's parents, Richard and Patricia Whitmore, standing on the deck in clothes that screamed old money, the kind of casual wealth that looks effortless because it's never had to try. Patricia wore white linen that somehow stayed pristine. Richard had on boat shoes that probably cost more than my Honda's monthly payment. They were smiling, welcoming, arms open wide. And in that moment, as I clutched my broken duffel bag and prepared to play my part, I realized something that made my blood run cold. They were performing too. Patricia Whitmore's hug felt like being embraced by a department store mannequin. All the right movements, none of the warmth. She smelled like expensive perfume and old secrets, and when she pulled back, her eyes did a quick inventory of my appearance that she probably thought I didn't notice. But I'd been in boardrooms with venture capitalists and CEOs. I knew how to read a predator. You must be Sarah, she said, her voice dripping with honey and something else I couldn't quite name. We've heard so much about you. Please don't be shy, consider this your home for the weekend. Richard shook my hand with just a fraction too much pressure, the kind of grip that's meant to establish dominance without being obvious about it. Any friend of Emma's is family to us, he said, and I watched his gaze flick to my duffel bag, to my faded jeans, to the Honda in the driveway. I played my part beautifully. I gushed about the house, let my voice crack with just a hint of overwhelm. Oh my goodness, this is just stunning. I've never seen anything like it. You must have worked so hard to afford something like this. 40 years in insurance, Richard said with practiced humility. Penny by penny, you know how it is. But I saw the Rolex on his wrist. I noticed the original artwork on the walls, pieces I recognized from galleries in Manhattan. This wasn't 40 years of careful saving. This was generational wealth, the kind that comes with trust funds and summer homes and children who've never had to check their bank balance before buying coffee. They were lying. Just like I was lying. But why? Emma was oblivious, exclaiming over everything, dragging David around to show him memories from his childhood, the tree he'd fallen from, the dock where he'd learned to fish. I watched them disappear toward the water, their laughter fading, and suddenly I was alone with the Whitmores on that pristine deck overlooking a lake that probably had a name and a history and a property value that would make most people weep. Let me show you to your room, Patricia said, and I followed her inside, pulling my duffel behind me, listening to its broken wheel scrape against the hardwood floors that were probably worth more than my actual car. She led me to a guest room that was bigger than my first apartment. King-sized bed with hotel-quality linens. Ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub. A view of the lake that belonged on a postcard. And there, on the dresser, she'd placed a stack of fresh towels with a little card that read welcome in calligraphy. I hope you'll be comfortable, she said. I know it's a bit much compared to what you're used to, but we want you to enjoy yourself. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about meeting the in-laws. This was a test. They were trying to see how I'd react to their wealth, whether I'd be impressed or intimidated or, and this made my skin crawl, whether I'd try to take advantage of it somehow. If you've ever been judged before you even opened your mouth, you know that feeling that settled in my chest right then. That mixture of rage and determination that makes you want to prove everyone wrong. I smiled at Patricia, making sure it reached my eyes. It's beautiful, I said softly. You're so generous to open your home like this. I just hope I don't embarrass Emma. I know I'm not. Well, I'm not used to places like this. Patricia patted my arm. Oh, sweetheart, don't you worry. We're all family here. But her eyes were cold as she said it, calculating, and I knew that whatever test she was running, I'd just passed the first round. Dinner that night was an elaborate performance staged on the deck overlooking the water. Richard grilled steaks, expensive cuts that he made sure to mention came from a specialty butcher, while Patricia orchestrated everything else with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Emma and David set the table, and I offered to help but was gently rebuffed, told to just relax and enjoy the view. So I sat there in my bargain store clothes and watched them perform their version of normal family life, and with every passing minute, I understood more about the game being played. Richard asked about my work with a carefully casual tone. Emma mentioned you do administrative work from home? That's right, I said, sticking to the script I'd built over decades. Data entry, mostly. Pays the bills. Barely. I laughed, making sure it sounded just a little bitter. But it gave me flexibility when Emma was young, and that's what mattered. That must have been so difficult, Patricia said, and there was genuine pity in her voice that made me want to scream. Raising a daughter alone on such a limited income. You're very brave. Emma squeezed my hand. Mom never complained. Not once. She made everything work. David was quiet, watching his parents watch me, and I saw something flicker across his face. Was it recognition? Discomfort? I couldn't tell. We ate as the sun set over the lake, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and they asked more questions, each one designed to probe deeper into my financial situation. How was I managing health insurance? Did I have any savings? What were my plans for retirement? I answered each question with perfect humility, describing a life on the edge, comfortable enough to survive but never enough to thrive. I saw them exchange glances, little looks that confirmed something between them, some shared understanding. They thought they had me figured out. They thought they knew exactly who I was. But then Patricia said something that changed everything. Sarah, I have to be honest with you. She set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When David told us about Emma, about her family, we were concerned. Not because of you, please don't misunderstand, but because we've seen so many situations where financial disparities create tension in marriages. We wanted to meet you, to understand your situation, to make sure that everyone's intentions were clear. The air felt thick suddenly, charged with something dangerous. Emma's face had gone pale. David was staring at his plate. What Mom's trying to say, Richard added, his voice gentle but firm, is that we've worked hard to build security for David. We want to make sure that security isn't compromised. They thought I was a gold digger. Or they thought Emma was. They'd invited us here to test whether I'd raised my daughter to marry for money, to see if we'd come here with our hands out, looking for a piece of their carefully hoarded wealth. I should have been angry. I should have thrown their suspicions back in their faces and walked out of that house with my dignity intact. But then I noticed something. The corner of Patricia's mouth was twitching, just barely. Richard's hands were clenched a little too tight around his fork. And David was watching me with an expression that looked almost like apology. They were nervous. And that's when it hit me. They weren't just testing me. They were afraid. Afraid that I'd see through them, afraid that I'd expose whatever they were hiding, afraid of something I hadn't even discovered yet. This wasn't a test I was taking. This was a test they were failing. I stood up slowly, and every eye turned to me. The sunset behind me cast my shadow long across their expensive deck, and I felt 63 years of hidden strength rise up in my chest like a tide. I think, I said quietly, we need to talk about what's really going on here. The silence that followed my words felt like glass about to shatter. Patricia's wine glass hovered halfway to her lips, frozen. Richard's jaw tightened. Emma looked at me with confusion and something that might have been fear, and David just sighed like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Mom. Emma's voice was small, uncertain. What are you talking about? I walked to the edge of the deck, looking out over the water that reflected the dying light like liquid fire, and I made a decision that I knew would change everything. Sometimes the truth is a weapon. Sometimes it's a shield. That night, I needed it to be both. I'm not who you think I am, I said, not turning around. None of us are, apparently. Sarah, Patricia started, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. Please. I turned back to face them, and I let every carefully constructed piece of my performance fall away. My shoulders straightened. My voice lost that apologetic edge I'd been using like armor. I make 6 figures. Have for 20 years. I own 4 rental properties. My investment portfolio is worth more than this lake house, and trust me, I know what lake houses like this cost because I've been looking at buying one myself. Emma's face went through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds. What? Mom, that's not, you can't. I clipped coupons because I'm smart with money, not because I needed to. I drove that Honda because it was reliable and paid off, and why would I buy something flashy just to impress people I don't care about impressing? I raised you to understand the value of $1, to work hard, to never take anything for granted. I looked at her, and my voice softened. I lied to you because I wanted you to build your own life, not wait around for an inheritance. I wanted you to be strong, independent, unburdened by the weight of expectations that come with knowing your mother could just write you a check for anything you wanted. The shock on her face cut deeper than any knife could, but I pushed forward because now that I'd started, I couldn't stop. But here's the interesting part. I turned to Richard and Patricia, and I watched them both shift uncomfortably. You two did the exact same thing, didn't you? This whole saved for 40 years story? This we're just regular people performance? That's all it is. A performance. Because nobody retires from selling insurance and ends up with a spread like this unless there's old money involved. Trust fund money. The kind of wealth you don't talk about because you're afraid of being judged for it. Richard's face had gone red. Now wait just a minute. I've met 100 men like you, Richard. Hell, I've done business with them. You have that particular combination of guilt and pride that comes from inheriting wealth you didn't earn. You perform humility because you think it makes you relatable, but you can't quite hide the markers. The watch, the art, the casual mention of the main house in Connecticut. You're playing poor the same way I've been playing poor, and for what? To test whether your son married someone who would love him for himself and not his trust fund. How dare you? Patricia started to stand, but David put his hand on her arm. She's right, Mom. His voice was tired, resigned. Just sit down. Please. The look Patricia gave her son could have melted steel, but she sat. The sunset had deepened to purple now, and someone had turned on the deck lights, and we all sat there in this golden glow that made everything look warm and perfect and completely artificial. David knew, I continued, looking at my son-in-law with new understanding. Didn't you? That's why you've been so quiet. You figured it out. He nodded slowly. The first time I came to your apartment with Emma. The books on your shelf, first editions of business classics, investment strategy guides. The laptop you quickly closed when we walked in. The way you talked about market trends at dinner once, with this expertise that didn't match your supposed job. He smiled sadly. I'm a teacher, Sarah. I notice when things don't add up. I just didn't say anything because, well, I understood why you were hiding it. My parents have been hiding the same thing their whole lives. David, Richard's voice was sharp, a warning. No, Dad. Enough. David stood up, and in that moment he looked older, wearier, like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long. Grandpa Whitmore made his fortune in pharmaceuticals. We're talking hundreds of millions. You and Mom have spent my entire life pretending we're middle class, making me work summer jobs I didn't need, refusing to help with student loans you could have paid off with pocket change. You said it was to keep me humble, to make sure I didn't turn out entitled. And maybe that worked. Maybe I'm a better person because I thought I had to earn everything. But it also meant I grew up watching you lie to everyone, including yourselves, about who you really are. Emma was crying now, silent tears sliding down her face, and I wanted to go to her, but I knew she needed space to process this. Space to be angry at me, which she had every right to be. If you've ever had to choose between protecting someone and being honest with them, you know there's no good answer. You know that sometimes love means lying, and sometimes it means telling the truth at the worst possible moment, and you never really know which is right until it's too late. Patricia was the first to speak after David sat back down. Her voice was different now, not the warm, welcoming tone from earlier, but something sharper, more real. You're judging us? You did the exact same thing to your daughter. I'm not judging you, I said, and I meant it. I'm recognizing us. All four of us, sitting here in our different disguises, all convinced we were protecting the people we love by lying to them. But what were we really protecting? Them? Or ourselves? Our comfort? Our control? Mom. Emma's voice was broken. Why didn't you tell me? I finally went to her then, knelt beside her chair, took her hands in mine. They were cold, shaking. Because I watched my sister marry a man who left her the moment she lost her inheritance to a bad investment. Because I've seen friendships destroyed over money, families torn apart by greed. Because I wanted you to build a life based on what you valued, not what you could afford. I wanted you to marry David because you loved him, not because he came from money, which it turns out he does, even though we both thought he didn't. She pulled her hands away. You didn't trust me. No, baby. I didn't trust the world. There's a difference. But was there? In that moment, with my daughter looking at me like I was a stranger, I honestly wasn't sure anymore. Richard cleared his throat. So what do we do now? We've all exposed each other. We've all admitted to being liars. Where does that leave us? Maybe, David said quietly, it leaves us with a chance to start over. To actually know each other as we really are instead of as we've been pretending to be. Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's very optimistic, David. But I think what this leaves us with is a weekend that's going to be extremely uncomfortable. She wasn't wrong. We finished dinner in near silence, the food turning to cardboard in my mouth. Emma wouldn't look at me. Patricia and Richard kept exchanging glances that spoke volumes I couldn't translate. David tried to make conversation, asking about the boat, the hiking trails, anything to fill the awful quiet, but his words fell flat. When we finally cleared the plates and retreated to our respective rooms, I lay in that king-sized bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the lake lap against the shore, and I wondered if I'd just destroyed the most important relationship in my life because I couldn't let a performance go unchallenged. My phone buzzed. A text from Emma, *, we need to talk tomorrow. Alone. *. I typed back, whatever you need. But lying there in the dark of someone else's expensive guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. The Whitmores had been nervous before I revealed myself. They'd been afraid. And David had mentioned student loans his parents refused to help with, a decision that seemed cruel even by the standards of character-building wealthy parents. Something else was going on here. Something beneath even the lies we'd all been telling. And I was going to find out what. I woke at dawn to the sound of raised voices drifting up from the first floor. Not loud enough to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Argument, recrimination, anger carefully controlled so as not to wake the guests. I lay there for a moment, debating whether to go back to sleep or investigate, when I heard a door slam and footsteps on the gravel outside. Through my window, I watched Richard Whitmore walk down to the dock in the grey pre-dawn light, his shoulders hunched like a man carrying the weight of the world. Something about the way he moved made my investigative instincts, the same ones that had built my fortune by knowing when people weren't telling the whole truth, start tingling. I dressed quietly and slipped out of the house. The morning air was cold, mist rising off the lake like ghosts, and my footsteps on the wooden dock made him turn around. Sarah. He didn't sound surprised to see me. Can't sleep either? Old habit. I do my best thinking in the early morning. I stood beside him, both of us looking out over the water. Want to talk about what's really going on here? He laughed, bitter and short. You mean besides the fact that we all spent yesterday evening revealing that we're liars? I mean the thing you're not talking about. The thing that made you and Patricia so nervous yesterday, even before I showed up. The reason you really invited us here. He was quiet for a long time. So long that I thought he might not answer at all. Then, how much did David tell Emma about our finances? Apparently nothing. They both thought you were middle class. Living comfortably but modestly. That's what we wanted him to think. What we needed him to think. Richard's hands gripped the dock railing. My father was a brilliant man. Ruthless in business, generous in his personal life, and absolutely terrible with choosing the people he trusted. 3 years ago, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Before it got too bad, he signed over control of everything to me. The pharmaceutical company, the investment portfolio, the real estate. All of it. I waited. This was the moment where people either told you the truth or gave you another layer of lies, and you had to let the silence stretch to see which they'd choose. It was all gone, he finally said, and his voice cracked. Not the money itself. That was safe in accounts my father couldn't touch. But the company? Bankrupt. He'd been making terrible decisions for years, hidden behind loyal employees who thought they were protecting him. By the time I took over, we were facing lawsuits, regulatory investigations, a complete collapse. I've spent the last 3 years liquidating everything, settling claims, trying to salvage anything I could while keeping it quiet enough that David wouldn't find out how bad it was. This house is mortgaged to the hilt. The Connecticut place? Sold last year, but I told David we were just spending more time up here. We're not broke, Sarah. We won't end up on the street. But we're not what we were, not what David grew up thinking we were, and if he knew the truth. Richard turned to look at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. He married your daughter 6 months ago. They're talking about buying a house, starting a family. And I can't help them the way I always promised I would. I can't be the safety net I was supposed to be. The sun was rising now, painting everything in shades of pink and gold, and I finally understood the full picture. They hadn't invited us here just to test Emma and me. They'd invited us here because they needed to know if we were the kind of people who'd support David or the kind who'd judge him for not being as wealthy as he thought he was. They'd been testing us to see if we'd stick around when the money wasn't what anyone expected. Does Patricia know you're telling me this? She's the one who suggested it. After last night, after everything came out, she said maybe it was time to stop performing for each other. That maybe the only way forward was total honesty, however uncomfortable. He smiled sadly. She's upstairs right now, probably having this same conversation with Emma. My heart clenched. Is Emma okay? Your daughter is tougher than you think. Angrier than you'd probably like. But tough. We stood there in companionable silence as the world woke up around us. A fish jumped somewhere out in the lake, leaving rings that spread across the surface and then disappeared. Everything looked peaceful, perfect, like a postcard of the life people dreamed about. I'm sorry, I said finally, for judging you yesterday. For assuming I knew what your performance was about. You weren't wrong though. We were testing you. And you were testing us. We're all guilty of the same sin, thinking we could control how people saw us by carefully managing what they knew. Richard turned to me. Can I ask you something? If you had it to do over again, would you still have hidden your money from Emma? I thought about it, really thought about it. About all the years of clipping coupons and driving that Honda and watching my daughter grow up believing that struggle was our natural state. About the pride I'd felt watching her graduate debt-free on scholarships and part-time jobs, never knowing she could have asked me for help. About the distance it had created between us, a distance I'd thought was protection but might have just been cowardice dressed up as wisdom. I don't know, I admitted. Ask me again after I talk to her. We walked back to the house together, and I found Emma sitting on the deck with a cup of coffee, Patricia beside her. They both looked like they'd been crying, but there was something lighter in the air now, like a pressure valve had been released. Mom. Emma stood when she saw me, and for a moment we just looked at each other across all the years of careful lies and protective silences. Then she hugged me, fierce and tight, and whispered in my ear, I'm so angry at you I can barely see straight. But I also understand why you did it. And I need you to understand that I'm not a child anymore. I don't need protection. I need a mother I can trust to tell me the truth. I know, I said into her hair. I'm so sorry. Patricia told me everything, she said, pulling back to look at me. About their finances, about what they've been going through. And I told her about how scared I am that David married me because I seemed safe, uncomplicated, financially unthreatening. That maybe if he'd known you were wealthy, he would have seen me differently. And what did she say? Emma smiled through her tears. She said that David chose teaching even though his grandfather wanted him in the family business. That he moved into a studio apartment in the city when he could have lived in their Connecticut house for free. That he's spent his whole life running away from money, so finding out his mother-in-law has it probably confirms every fear he has about himself. I looked over at David, who was standing in the doorway with his father, and I saw in his face the same mixture of fear and hope that must have been written all over mine. The four of us, five, once David joined us, spent the rest of that day talking. Really talking. About money and fear and the lies we tell ourselves about why we lie to others. About Richard's father and the slow, terrible loss of watching someone you love forget who they are. About Patricia's childhood with missionary parents who taught her that wealth was something to be ashamed of. About my sister's failed marriage and how it had poisoned my trust in people. About Emma's resentment at always feeling like we were struggling when apparently we weren't. About David's complicated relationship with his family's wealth and his desperate desire to be valued for something other than his last name. We didn't solve everything that weekend. You don't undo decades of carefully constructed personas in 3 days, no matter how many tearful conversations you have. But we started something. We began the slow, painful process of actually knowing each other instead of the versions we'd invented. On Sunday afternoon, as we packed to leave, Patricia pulled me aside. "I need to apologize," she said. "For testing you. For assuming the worst. For that comment about making sure David's security wasn't compromised. That was cruel, and it came from a place of fear that had nothing to do with you." "I tested you too," I reminded her. "I came here in disguise, just like you invited us here under false pretenses. We're even." "Are we though?" She looked past me to where Emma and David were loading the car, their heads close together, talking quietly. "Because I think what we both did is more complicated than right or wrong. We protected our children by hiding from them. We taught them to be strong by refusing to show them our own strength. And now we're all paying the price for that protection." She wasn't wrong. That night, driving home in the gathering darkness, Emma finally asked the question I'd been dreading: "How much exactly?" I told her. Told her about the investments, the rental income, the consulting work. Watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, hurt, understanding, and something that might have been relief. "I could have gone to my first-choice college," she said quietly, "instead of the state school." "You could have. But you also graduated with job offers because you'd worked internships instead of spring breaks in Cancun. You learned to budget, to save, to value what you earned. That wasn't your choice to make for me, Mom." "You're right. It wasn't. And I'm sorry." We drove in silence for a while, the highway unwinding before us like all the conversations we still needed to have. Then Emma said, "David wants to tell his students. About his family, about the money, about how he's been afraid his whole life that people only value him for what he could give them." "What do you think about that?" "I think it's brave. I think it's terrifying. I think maybe honesty is harder than any of us wanted to admit." She looked at me then, really looked at me. "Can you teach me?" "About investing, about money, about all the things you know that you never shared." And that's how it started. Not with forgiveness, that would come later, in pieces, earned through consistency and time. But with a beginning. With a choice to stop performing and start revealing. With the understanding that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt from the ground up, one honest conversation at a time. The Whitmores invited us back to the lake house a month later. This time I drove my Tesla, the one I'd been hiding in a friend's garage for 2 years. This time Patricia wore her grandmother's pearls instead of Costco copies. This time Richard talked about his father's illness without pretending it hadn't affected their finances. This time David told us about the essay his students wrote after he shared his story, about wealth and shame and the masks we wear. And this time, when we sat on that deck watching the sunset paint the water, we were all there as ourselves. Flawed, complicated, still learning how to be honest, but present in a way we'd never been before. If you've stuck with me through this whole story, thank you. Thank you for listening to an old woman talk about the complicated ways we love and lie and protect the people who matter most. I don't have easy answers. I don't know if what I did was right or wrong. I only know that sometimes the best gift you can give someone isn't protection. It's truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. And if this resonated with you, if you've ever struggled with how much to reveal and how much to hide, check the description box below. There are more stories like this there, stories about the messy, complicated reality of families who love each other despite, or maybe because of, all the ways they get it wrong. Because in the end, we're all just trying our best with the limited wisdom we have. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough.